I'm still under the impact of his loss. As I told numerous times to people who care to listen to me, I felt that with the news of his ptirah, that the world has a little less sun and a little less light, and I'm under that impact. But you know, Chazal tell us that Sfarim tell us that the concept of Shloshim, we have many pathways. There's Yom HaMitah, and then there's the Shiva, 3 days, 7 days, a month, a Yortzeit. What do these function as? These function as the neshama goes on its pathway to nitzchiyut, to eternity. We really want to catch on. We want to still learn from him. There's so much we learn from you, and we want to catch on, and we can. It reminds me of the picture of the painting of Michelangelo of the story of creation, where God reaches a hand, the finger, and Adam reaches it. They want to reach, but obviously you cannot reach it. It's never gap. That gap never stands. And likewise, we still want to grasp on to the Torah and to the Chachma and the personality and all the Atzilut that Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal had. I know we can, but perhaps in speaking a little bit about him, and speaking about, not say much, what has, many of the things we have, Haspedim, you've listened to, how they concentrated on his Ben Adam Lachvera, or how they concentrated on his fantastic relationship with his father, with his parents, with his father and mother, how he was a fantastic family person, how he bridged the world of Gadlus on the one hand, and then being a simple father going with his children to play or to assist them in school or on vacations and so on and so forth, was something, the kind of simple normalcy that was his. Generally Gedolim, we are used to Gedolim. Rav Kamenetsky once said that American Bachram have an image of a Gadol as if he has horns, and that's what the image Gedolim has. He was the exact opposite of that. And the truth is that, I must tell you the truth, coming from Chaim Berlin, it was very difficult because on the one hand, you must understand, I'm not criticizing my Rabbi Rafutner Zatzal. My Rabbi Rafutner was my Rabbi, and I have all the awe and respect for him. But when he was in yeshiva, he had to, in a manner of speaking, elevate what we call the status of Bnei Torah. What was a yeshiva boy? What was a yeshiva bacher? Yeshiva bacher was a schlepper, essentially. Those of you know the history of Musar. Why did Rabbi Yisrael Salanter help the yeshiva movement, and what did he contribute to the yeshiva movement? Because at the time of the Haskalah, etc., people looked down on yeshiva bacher. Oh, what is it they used? We don't know Yiddish, unfortunately. We should. They said yeshiva bacher is a bankwetscher, he's a battler, and what does he know, etc. So he, the Rishon Salanter, created, and we see pictures of earlier yeshivas. Rafutner himself, when he was in Slobodka, sharply dressed with a tie and combed, and they were like Berlin university students, and sometimes they even behaved that way. But anyway, what I want to say is that that was the image. Specifically later when Rafutner came to America, when Rav Soloveitchik came to America in the 30s, and Rafutner felt it was his job to elevate the yeshiva bacher, and therefore he spoke a lot about Kvod HaTorah. It was very much to him that Americans have to learn that the knowledge of Torah is not just something your bankwetscher, your batlan, but something, and he elevated it. And specifically to him, it was very important that when the boy comes into him, first time I went into him, I was not exactly 15 at that time because I came a little later to him, and everybody warned me that when you have to sit. Did you ever go to the Lubavitcher Rebbe? Oh, obviously you're young, and you're not messianists who think he lives. They told you, he will stretch his hand out, but you don't touch him, etc. Well, same thing that they taught me that when I come, okay, I sit down, they'll tell me sit down, etc. But then when you walk, you have to walk out this way. So I happen to have walked into a clothes closet. So he called me, he said, he put his hand on me, he said, no, you don't have to do it. That's just for certain chevron. That's not the point. The point is that he spoke about that. And sometimes even in the Mamarim that he said, there's a famous phrase that if you listen it out of context, what I just told you, you think he says, an Adam Gadol, a big person, somebody who's a Talmid Chacham, has to go and shout on the street, I am an Adam Gadol. Ich bin an Adam Gadol. You know, so there were many shtick. If somebody wanted to learn the wrong things in Chaim Berlin, you could have learned them. Rabbi Lichtenstein said the exact opposite. It's as if he told himself, I am an Adam Gadol, but I'm not going to behave like that now. I'll behave with full normalcy. And that was something that I constantly appreciated of him. And how much I appreciated, I'll tell you in the following, just a simple story. You know, I had the great privilege, you know, we were on sabbatical 20 years ago, and also since we made Aliyah 10 years ago, he gave a shiur once a week at the Yeshiva University in Israel, in Gus Kollel. And whenever I was in Israel, whether I was for a month or for a year or the last 10 years, I always went and prepared the whole week for his shiur with some chavrusas. To make a long story short, every Wednesday night. To make a long story short, but one night a month he devoted not to the shiur as such, but he devoted it to what he called the press conference, which means you can ask him any question that you wish, and he answered it with the kind of breadth and depth that only Rabbi Lichtenstein had. Okay. It happened to be at the time when we came to Israel was the week of Gush Katif, you know, when the de-annexation of Gush Katif, the Hitnatkut from Gush Katif. And next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, so Al Capone, it was the night of the press conference, and we're sitting and talking, and Rav Lichtenstein was a dove, you know that very well. As a matter of fact, first day that we came to Israel, after we settled, I guess, and I had a chance to buy the Haaretz. Front page was Rav Lichtenstein's article on for this engagement, this dovish article, and Esther said, Rabbi Lichtenstein can teach Torah from the pages of Haaretz. That's really a big thing. And he did that many times. That's not the point. But Al Capone, that's what we talked about. So one night, he devoted his class to that, and the questions were of that. And as it says, this, Rabbi Lichtenstein, with his breadth and with his tolerance and with his dispassionate analysis, came out on the dovish side. So a bacher of 19 asks in full tmimut, in full sincerity, not knowing what he says. But Rav Lichtenstein, such decisions shouldn't be made, he didn't say by you, shouldn't be made by a real Gedolim. In other words, you're a gadol without a beard, you're a gadol without a black hat. You're speaking in an English-speaking yeshiva, what happens, why you? The yeshiva of Panovich and the yeshiva of Hebron, they should make such decisions. So if he would have been in Chaim Berlin, as I told yesterday somebody, he would have thrown him out. The Gemara says in Chulin, you learn in Chul, that Talmid Chacham she'ein bo das, nevela taiva hemena, that the Talmid Chacham that doesn't have das, even a nevela is better. What's the expression of nevela? Why this expression? Because a nevela gives off an odor. So when you're in the city, you have to make sure that there's no nazikin from an odor, so you throw it out of the city. He would have been thrown out. As a friend of mine corrected me when I said, he said, no, he would have been killed. And Rav Lichtenstein, as if he's not speaking about himself, goes back to the question and analyzes, well, what is a God? Why do I think that Rav Shach is not a God? And even if he knows Kol HaTorah Kula, why do I think that Rav Shach, for example, did not have the right position on this? And so on and so forth. As they say in Yiddish, there's an expression as if he's not talking about himself. There was no I, there was 99% no ego. There was 190% no ego there. Everything clear and dispassionate. And that's the way he looked at himself. That's the way he looked at himself. Anybody could ask him, anybody could tell him he's wrong. He would argue with you, okay? But as you argue, you can argue, etc., etc. But that's exactly why he captured certain people. That's exactly why he paid. This great Gadol, as Rav Kamenetsky, didn't need to have horns to was a Gadol. He was a Gadol because he was a Gadol. That's the exact point. So what should I tell you? He was criticized in Israel because he was in Gush Etzion. So the story, the Gush Etzion, and he was with Rabbi Mital, the only two yeshivas who were together for so many years, and they fought plenty, but civilly. I was there once in summer where Rav Lichtenstein made a drasha, gave a speech, a maimer, and Rabbi Mital patched up Namid, and he goes on the Amid and says something, criticizing him, and then Rav Lichtenstein again, everything is covered, as the Gemara says, Talmidei Chachamim, es vohev b'sufa, they end with love, and that was fancy, that everybody knows. But when Rav Lichtenstein first came to the Gush, he was criticized as not being Zioni enough, or as they would say, Mamlachti enough. That's the new phrase. Not what? So he doesn't stress Tanakh. He only stresses Gemara. So it wasn't direct. At the Purim Suda, he was a little bit, high. I could never be imbibing that much, but he always was in control. But nevertheless, it was a Purim Suda. He said, people criticize me for not knowing Tanakh. I dare everybody at this table or in this Beis Medrash, I dare everybody, test me if there is one Radak that I don't know. One Radak that I don't know. That was him. Of course, he loved Eretz Yisrael. He was a Tzioni. He went to Eretz Yisrael. It wasn't so easy. When he went to Eretz Yisrael, you have to realize we already spoke about Rav Soloveitchik's retirement, and there was no doubt that if Rav Soloveitchik ever retires, there's only one candidate to become the full Rosh Yeshiva Bayu in the same sense that Rav Soloveitchik is. And nevertheless, he went to the Gush, which was only in the beginning. 40 years later, it was developed, but not in 1970. It was the pilot year. I remember we were there in Israel also that year. Not that year, that vacation when we met the first time in Bat Yagan, and so on and so forth. And he gave up a lot. He gave up a lot. He himself said so, and you'll see from what he said what he gave up. There's a book that Rav Sabato interviewed him. What's the name of the book? For some reason I forget it. Mevakshei Panecha. Also, Rabbi Helfgot, you know that as well as I do that book. But you know what he says there? He says he suffered. Why he gave up a lot. He considered it a sacrifice. Because he knew that his kids wouldn't get the same kind of college education that he gets in. They would not have gone, they didn't go to Harvard like he did. And he felt that they should have gotten a good education. And so on and so forth. And he gave up a lot. Rav Soloveitchik was against it, was very, very angry at the family. And to have the grandchildren grow up under Rav Soloveitchik's tutelage, not for 1 year or 2 years, but totally is a big thing. Everybody knows it's a big thing. But his Havas Yisrael was such that he gave it up. And there were many other things, but his godless, I don't feel like I'm ready to speak about his godless. I never will be ready for that. I will never understand. But there's one thing that the world doesn't know, and therefore I feel I should share it with you. He went. Let's start with the beginning. When he went to Chaim Berlin, he got a nickname, Babe. Why was he called Babe? Because he was the youngest guy in Rav Hutner's class, and he sat on Rav Hutner's lap. But then, when he had to go to high school, his mother was a very tough woman, and she knew what she wanted with her child. She was a very educated woman. She was one of the few women who graduated, in Telz. There were Telz of Lithuania. There was a girls' school, Yavne. There, unlike other schools, they taught in Hebrew, not in Yiddish or whatever. The Yavne Girls' School. That's where the Hebraism probably comes from. To make a long story short, so the Rav Aaron went to what they call BTA, Manhattan High School, Brooklyn Yeshiva University High School. At the graduation, when he has to apply to YU, and Rafutner was very angry at that, but Mrs. Lichtenstein Mrs. Blumer Lichtenstein carried the day. So they ask you, one thing is, what Gemaras are you familiar? So sometimes somebody writes, Bava Tzia, Makos, and he wrote, in all honesty, all of Shas. That was Iran at that age. And when I heard of him the first time in New York, high schools and colleges, there's a major existential question every summer. The existential question every summer is, I don't know these days, but at least when I was your age, the major existential question was, what bracha do you make on an ice cream sandwich? What's the shaila? The shaila is, you eat the ice cream shackle or you eat the mezainis. Who was the posek, the first posek for American kids? Rav Aaron. Babe Lichtenstein says X. Whatever he said. I forgot what he said. It's not, but he was the posek. He was that. And so on and so forth. So I will not tell you many stories. I want just to sort of show you how that he was a different kind of gadol. Perhaps if I may end this part of the talk, just a little bit of his Torah, I'll say what Rav Soloveitchik said on the Brisker Rav, because it's really the best analogy. I was thinking a lot. The best analogy that's found. You know very well that one of the animamins is that one of the principles of the 13 principles of faith is that Nevuat Moshe is true, that Nevuat Moshe, the prophecy of Moshe, cannot be contradicted, and it will always. So Rav Soloveitchik, when he spoke about Brisk, he said, and I remember him thundering about the Brisker of Hesped, he said, what does that mean, the 13th Animamim, that Moshe Rabbeinu is true? He says, what it means is, it's not enough to say that Moshe was a bigger Navi than Yecheskel. He knew more than Yecheskel, etc., or Yirmiyahu, or anyone else for that matter. Moshe Rabbeinu was different. In what way was it different? In what way was Moshe Rabbeinu different? So Rav Soloveitchik gave first a halachic example, and then I tell what he said. He said like this, you know very well by now, you know, that there are Sfarim, what we call the Monei HaMitzvos. People count mitzvahs. Everybody agrees there are 613 mitzvos, but what they are, we don't know. Okay. Now there's another machlokes or rishonim among the Monei HaMitzvos. The Monei HaMitzvos is whether we count mitzvos the Rabbanan in the Minyan HaMitzvos. And the shitta of the Bahagi is that you count mitzvos the Rabbanan in the Minyan HaMitzvos. Comes along the Rambam and asks if he's right, the Bahagi, that you count mitzvos the Rabbanan. So when Moshe Rabbeinu said in the Torah, Al Pi Hashem Yachnu, Al Pi Hashem Yisau, it's a Dvar HaNavi. So it's a mitzvah to listen to the Navi also. So that should also be the mitzvah. So every time Pi Hashem Yachnu, Al Pi Hashem Yisau, it should be another mitzvah, another mitzvah. Said Rav Soloveitchik, no. The difference of Moshe Rabbeinu's is that Moshe Rabbeinu is the only human being whose words become a cheftz of Torah. And if they become a cheftz of Torah, they go with the rules of Torah. So if you don't find the mitzvah of Api Hashem Yachnu, that's not anymore. You understand? Because Moshe Rabbeinu, by definition, is different. He thundered the Rav. And my uncle was different. It's not that he was bigger than other Gedolim. It's not that he was better than other Gedolim. It's not that he knew more than other, but he was different. Rav Aaron was different. Rav Aaron was different. That's all I can end with at this part. I just want to talk about one thing that I brought this Sfarim. I never plagiarized, but certainly this is the last collection of his psukim that he was still alive. He still wrote an introduction. And this is before that, there's a set of Sfarim called Shurei Rav Aaron, but this is the last Masechta on Hayrius. and there's some very, very, very important pieces of Torah, and maybe I'll just repeat something that he says, and then I'll try to look at a little bit on his derech, not much, this is another time, but also something that is very relevant to us. It's in the headlines that we are Isaac as Bnei Torah. So let's start. There's a mitzvah of Minui Dayanim, to appoint Dayanim. There's also a concept that Dayanim have to be Musmachim. What does Musmachim means? You get smicha from somebody somebody till Moshe Rabbeinu. That's the original concept of smicha. You know that, correct? Now the Gemara says that Minu Dayanim has the smicha is only in Eretz Yisrael. All right? Comes along the Ran and asks, it's not a mitzvah hatli about it, it's Truma Meister, etc., etc. Yeah. But how do we know what's the source of the Gemara that it's only in Eretz Yisrael? So he says, the Gemara says there's a pasuk in the Yishalmi, in the Bible there's not even a pasuk, but the Yishalmi there's a pasuk, they say Yoshvim alad maschem, that smicha can be on Eretz Yisrael. So he says, so you'll see two things. So he says, okay, number one, the pasuk does mention smicha, and number two, even if it mentions smicha and it's a Gzeres HaKosov, so he never liked. Well, it's the Gzeres HaKosov. So what's behind the Gzeres HaKosov? So what does Gzeres HaKosov tell us? What does Gzeres HaKosov tell us? So he has a whole piece of Torah in the Minchas Aviv that he wrote. I can date when he wrote it because it was even before I got married, so that means it was before 1964. And he says in Yesod that since Dayanut has to do with Klal Yisrael, and Klal Yisrael is only a metaphysical unit that's a totality in Eretz Yisrael. That's not his. He quotes it from the Avnei Nezer. The Avnei Nezer says, you know very well that there were two Britot. There was the Brit at Sinai, and there's the Brit you're going to lead in Devarim, at the end of Devarim at Arvot Moav. Why did we do that? Because that was another bris. It was the bris before you go to Israel. And what's Ma'achet Klal Yisrael is Eretz Yisrael. And Mamela, only in Eretz Yisrael, all those mitzvos that depend on the tzibur, Smicha, Minui Melech, etc., 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 are only Shayach in Eretz Yisrael, where we are a people. In here, we're not a people, so it's silly to do Egel Arufa here. Kiddush HaChodesh. It's absurd to do here, because we're not a people here. In Eretz Yisrael, you can make Kiddush HaChodesh. So much so that he doesn't say, but you have to add in. This is an important Mareh Makam. The Rambam says it in 3 places. Rambam says in 3 places. In Sefer HaMitzvos, in Perisham Shnayis of Masechet Bechorot, Perek Daled, and he's hinting to it in the Yad. Rambam says like this: if Chas v'Shalom, there would be a condition. Says it should never happen that there won't be Jews in Eretz Yisrael. We wouldn't have Kiddush HaChodesh, and all the Moadim would be Batel. Even though the Moadim are not mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz, I know that Shona, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, and Pesach and everything have a different time in Eretz Yisrael. Anybody who's there, Yom Tov, knows that it's a different time than in Chutz La'aretz. Besides that, here it's 2 days. But you understand, it's only in Eretz Yisrael. That's the Yisod. And then, that's the Yisod Aleph. Then going further in Hilchos Dayanim, he asks a very good question. You know very well that there are limits on who can be a Dayan. Can you give me a limit on who can be a Dayan? Okay, Melech, very good. Melech cannot be a Dayan either. Correct. That's good. And then, out of the Pilpul Chaverim, there comes out a halacha. That depends on expertise. That, Shmai Aftalion, of course, they could be. Aleph. I want to add something to that. Also based on what Rav already said, but he didn't, yeah, he maybe have said that the Ran spelled it out. Just as you understand that members of Sanhedrin have different functions, etc. Sometimes the Sanhedrin does the same thing. You don't necessarily have to have two courts. Just a simple question. You know that there's a Sanhedrin of 3 and a Sanhedrin of 71. What's the difference? Why is the Sanhedrin of 3 never called the Sanhedrin and the Sanhedrin of 23 or 71 called the Sanhedrin? Because the Sanhedrin, I'll tell you, I'm not going to. Because the Sanhedrin of 3 is only, how do I call it? When they sit and they're passing their Sanhedrin. Once they leave, they're not Sanhedrin anymore. But the Sanhedrin of 71, their Sanhedrin even if they disband. I'll give you a simple example. There's a halacha of Nasi ba'amcha lo ta'or. You should not curse a Nasi. So tell me, only when they sit together in the Supreme Court building, so to say, are you over when you curse the Nasi? And what if he goes on the street and he gets an aliyah and you hate him and you curse him? Then he's not a... Why? Because the Gavra is still a Gavra of Sanhedrin. Just to understand that there's such a thing as a Gavra of Sanhedrin. Okay. What's the function of a Gavra of a Sanhedrin? Let's go to something. Would a woman be kafir or you are there? Yes, no. So of course, it depends who you ask. But the answer is, I think that yes. Because the function of the Beis Din of Gerut is not I'm not done anything. In Mamonas, there could be a geir and an isha, maybe possible. By Mamonas, it depends on Kiblu Alai. There's another heter. Prove it to me. Prove it to me that a woman could be done. Prove it to me that a woman could be done. Not a geir, a woman. Huh? Dvora. Who says that? I said that. You didn't say that either. Who says it? Toises. And what does the Rashba add when the Rashba says that? The Makabel. Okay, but by Geras that's not so. There's no concept of Kabbalah. But nevertheless, what's the function of the 3 Dayanim who see the Tvila? They've done something. There's a Masau Matan. That's the Rabbi does before, who okays the Geras. What does he do? They're nothing more than, as you understand, I'm only using a borrowed term. By Kedushin, what's the function of Edom? Just to say that Chaim and Adam and Leah got married then? Adam and Chava got married then? The function is to be Mekayim Hadovar. They don't do anything. There's no psak they have to see. That's why if the Edom had their back to the Chassan Kala and they didn't see the ring, even though they heard Hareyat Mekudeshet Li B'Tabat Zo, the Kedushin are nothing. Why? Because you have to have Kiyum Hadovar. The function of Edom by Geras, of Bezdin by Geras, is I think the same thing. The function is the same thing, then therefore it's not even a doichak to say. I mean, you have the other Marim Akaimis, and there is a Masechet Geras. Those of you who heard the Rabbanit Tokaczynski speak when she was in New York last time, she didn't mention it in her talk either, but she quoted the Stipler's son, he was a fantastic Baki, wrote Perushim on Masechtas that we never learned. One of them is a small Masechta called Geras. And he says openly, because he didn't know about this, he wrote it 20 years ago. He didn't know about this issue in America. And he wrote openly, for a woman, you should have 3 women because of Bezin for that purpose. So that's one of the things that I came to me I came onto that road by listening and learning Rav Aaron Shurim on the kifa, on the tokef and the tafkid of a bezdin and Yehei Zichro Baruch. Want to ask me any questions, please? Even on the psak part. Perhaps he would have responded, yes, I should tell you an analogous thing. And perhaps he would have said, sometimes he would say, but you don't do that. He would say that sometimes. I can tell you an example, but and so on and so forth. But let me tell you where he says it in print, where you don't have to have my Chavos Das. Sabato in the same book asks him about woman rabbis. And he has a whole dispassionate 3 pages there discussing essentially what is Simcha these days. As the Trumas Association says, Simcha says that you know how to pass this part of your day, that part of your day, and the other part of your day. It's not traditional, but you see that he doesn't lose sleep over it. And he says it in print. That's the only reason I say what he says. Although another time I must tell you the truth. This is, so I don't know why in my rabbinate I had this chus, I'm saying it ironically, of having many unfortunate questions of Kohanim with people whom they are not allowed to marry, Pashat Shah. And in one particular situation, I thought I had a heter, but obviously it was 15, 20 years ago. So I always checked with the Ran, and he said, you're right, the Rav really said that. But at that time, the Rav wasn't askable anymore. He said, wait till I come to Israel, and I'll speak. He held very much from Shloshim Zalman. And Shloshim Zalman said no. The Ran bowed his mind to the Shloshim Zalman, and I bowed my mind to him. But even though he saw authority and he recognized someone's authority, he said no. But he also was not afraid to say yes. I didn't speak about women's Tefillah. I spoke to him about women's Megillah, and he told me that in Yerushalayim they did it. That was in women's Tefillah. After that time, I had a big case of women's Tefillah in Helfgot. For some reason, I felt, I tell you the truth, some of these things I feel so definitely about. I didn't need to ask him. It was only a matter of. Yes, it almost, somebody gives you a good shir on women's tefillah, it's very difficult to give a good shir on why yes, because it's so simple that it's yes. So I definitely didn't speak about that. Yeah. Rav Hutner was very much against it. On the whole women's issue, he told me, on what? No. Oh. Told me is there Shloshim. At the moment, okay, you asked me, this thing that I quoted from you, which is was written, as I told you, 100 years ago. And Rav Hutner didn't like it, and he told me why. It was at the time when I learned the Chavrusa with Rav Hutner, even though I was the only guy in Berlin who had permission to go to Rav Soloveitchik Shuri. I made a deal with him, Remember, those days yeshivas didn't have 5,000 students. Chaim Berlin had maybe 150. YU in the Simcha class maybe had 300, etc., not much more. And when I threatened to leave, because I was hooked on Rav Soloveitchik, so I learned with him in the afternoon once a week, Maral and his Mamorim, and 3 times a week I went to Rav Soloveitchik in the morning. So that was the period. And we fought a lot on this piece. But while fighting on this piece, he, for example, didn't like the fact that you don't have to have a time for Gzeis HaKosov. The Yerushalmi says Gzeis HaKosov. So we fought about it. That's not the point. At that time, he told me, do waste as a can kol hatoyre kula. That was his opinion. He knows kol hatoyre kula. More than that, there's no bigger compliment in yeshiva than telling on somebody 6 times, you know that he knows kol hatoyre kula. But he's wrong. You know that he knows kol hatoyre kula. But he's wrong. Well, initially, on 2 things I can mention that Rav Lichtenstein disagreed. And although Rav Hutner's was not exactly that number one on Zionism, Rav Hutner, strange person, Rav Hutner, who was a Talmud of Rav Kook, and Rav Hutner in whose sukkah the picture of Rav Kook hung, came a certain time, about 51, 52, where the picture went off. just as Rav Hutner wrote a sefer called Torat HaNazir, it first had the Haskama of Rav Chaim Ozer Godzensky and the Kovner Ruv and Rav Kook, and the second edition, Rav Kook's letter came out, and the third edition or the fourth edition, all Haskamas came out. And the other thing that he disagreed, number one is Zionism, and number two on the Shoah. Rav Hutner, although I was influential in sort of being baracheich, softening Rav Hutner's position, because when Rav Hutner came out with a particular article about the Shoah, as if saying that he believes in the Mipnei Chatoinu thing, I had a big argument with him. And when it was translated into English, that sentence came out. And not only that, I had something to do with the fact that he then fired Rabbi Avigdor Miller from being Mashgiach, because Avigdor Miller wrote books about Mipnei Chatoinu, and that's what I told him, that I can't be in the yeshiva with such a Mashgiach, and I don't think any sane person can be in the yeshiva with such a Mashgiach. And you yourself said once that you must be a Novi Hashem to say such things. And when that article where he implicated otherwise came out. So in that sense, but essentially, he and Rav Lichtenstein disagreed on these two things. And Rav Lichtenstein says that in many articles that you can't say, he says in one particular case, it's better to ask a question, albeit 6 million times, rather than have one bad answer that God is unfair.
It's obviously a very bittersweet day for all of us today. I did not get a chance to hear Rabbi Linzer, but I did hear Rabbi Krauss, and who was a real Talmud Chaver, and really a Chaver, and a Chavrusa of Rav Lichtenstein, and knew him very intimately. I've spoken publicly already in a few settings, and so today is much more of a sheer, not so much a sheer, but an overview. Okay, an overview of. I wanted to explore Rav Lichtenstein's approach to Psak Halacha. Obviously, it's not going to be an exhaustive discussion, and obviously there's much more to say. But I just wanted to touch on some key elements in his methodology. So I wanted to this morning. I wanted to explore the topic of Rav Lichtenstein's approach to Psak Halacha, as with Rabbi Soloveitchik as well. Rav Lichtenstein was not known as much as a posek in the classical sense of the great Meshivim. When we speak about people like Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach or Rav Moshe Feinstein or the great Meshivim, but he also engaged from time to time in Psak Halacha, both on a communal level as well as privately. There are many, many tshuvot that he wrote to individuals, guidance that he gave. I was involved in a number of situations, very delicate situations, weddings, and issues that came up that I consulted with him, and I even have some written tshuvot that are not public, that, you know, who knows, one day they may be made public. And I know that during the 1980s, when there were issues with Soviet Jews, Soviet Jewry, questions that came up, some serious questions, he was approached. And so he definitely engaged in the realm of Psak Halacha. However, that was not obviously his main focus. His main focus was Havayas Dabai V'Rava, teaching and learning the daily shir, and certainly that was his main area. But I did want to explore this one area, which is an interesting and fascinating area, and some of the important lessons that Rav Aaron Zichron Livracha Zatzal gave us and bequeathed to us and emphasized in his approach. And again, as I say, I feel inadequate in certain ways to fully capture his approach on these issues, but still I think it's important. He continues to teach us, which is something that I felt very much this week. Just a personal story. I got to learn with Rav Lichtenstein in the early 1980s when he was in his B'chol Tokfo, B'chol Gvuraso, and I was very lucky and privileged that At the same time, two of his children were in the yeshiva as well, and I got very friendly with them, with Moshe and Meir. And that was how I got, in addition to being a student of Rav Lichtenstein, I also was, thank God, I was able to see him as well in the home. I was invited on a number of occasions, and I got to meet the family. And as someone, I don't remember who said in one of the Hespedim, not the Hespedim, but one of the talks, there's certain people, great people, when you meet them and you're in awe of them, as you get to know them more, your respect for them lessens, unfortunately, because you see other sides of them. But seeing Rav Lichtenstein at home and getting to know him on a different level, it was just the opposite. You were just even more impressed how it was tacho kevaro. He was yashar in everything that he did, even in the less formal context. And as I said to my wife this week, one night I was very tired. It was 9:20, and one of my children is, thank God, has gotten very makbid on tefillah b'tzibur, and it was 9:23, and there's a 9:30 minyan in Teaneck, and I didn't daven Marav yet. I was exhausted, and my son came up to me and said, you know, Abba, can we go to the 9:30 minyan? So my first reaction was going to be, I'm too tired. You know, daven at home. Is it really a whatever? You could give a whole all the rationalizations that we all do, and then literally a picture of Rav Aaron came in my head, and I said, what would he both halachically but also educationally? What kind of message was I going to give my 13-year-old child if I just said, okay, I'm too tired? And so we went in, we got in the car, and we went to daven Marav. So still impact in very, very strong ways. So if you could distribute these sources, they're all in English. I tried to, because I'm also giving this talk in another setting. So I wanted to make sure that everyone had it accessible. Most of these sources were written in English, many of them, and so they remain in English. So the first thing I wanted to start with was, of course, that Rav Lichtenstein, for anyone who knew him, was certainly a person of great halachic fidelity and very punctilious in his own personal practice. That's not what I'm talking about here today. Rav Aaron was, at least to me, the frummest person I ever met in my life. For example, he never used Eruvin because he followed the sheet of the Rambam that says that almost all of our Eruvin are puzzle. All the major Eruvin. The only place he ever carried on Shabbat, he didn't carry in Yerushalayim, even though it has an excellent Eruv. The only place he carried was in Alon Shvut, because Alon Shvut actually has a fence, a real fence around it, a wall around it. And so that was the only place he ever carried. Somebody told me recently that when Alon Shvut was expanded, you know, there's that new neighborhood, so they actually made holes in the fence, and they didn't tell that many people, because they certainly didn't tell the Arabs, because but they didn't tell that many people. And Rav Aaron, when he found out a few weeks later, he was very upset that no one had told him, because he was continuing to carry. He thought the fence had been continued. So Rav Aaron was, so to speak, one of the very, very makbid in kakala v'chamura in all areas. I remember in the early 1980s when I was at YU, so Rav Aaron would come for Shabbat, and it was a tremendous hassle. We were having a Shabbaton, and he was makbid on Chadash, on Yashan, right? On Yashan. And in those days, it's not like today. Today, every product that you buy, you can get in Yashan. In 1984, 85, it was not such a simple thing. You had to schlep to Muncie, you had to schlep to Lakewood to get Yashan rolls. Nobody was makbid, except for Rav Aaron Soloveitchik. And so, to get that, and so it definitely makes an impact. But that's not what I want to speak about. I want to speak about his approach to Psak. But the first issue, in general, when he approached the question on a communal level, was a very strong sense of religious commitment as well as Yirat Shamayim. He wrote a very famous tshuva that's printed in the Sefer Rabbi Krauss mentioned, Minchat Aviv. It was translated into English as well. In the late 1970s, Bnei Akiva, the Hanhalah Artzit of Bnei Akiva, asked him about students Chanichim going on Tiyulim on Sukkot. And the question was, can you organize lechatchila a tiyul where you know me lechatchila you're not going to have access to a sukkah? It's not that by chance, but can you? So Rav Aaron goes through a whole long shir, and his maskanot are, if you look at one, it is permitted to go on a trip during Chol HaMoed Sukkot, even if it is clear that the participants will not be able to perform the mitzvah of sukkah during the tiyul. So Rav Aaron says, if you look at the strict halacha, you're allowed to lechatchila plan a tiyul in that sense. But then he says, up until now, we spoke from a purely and exclusive halachic vantage point. However, on a practical level, the matter seems radically different. One should be firmly and sharply opposed, both educationally and from the perspective of Jewish beliefs, to tiyulim or activities organized in a way that involves not observing the mitzvah of sukkah. The existence of formal exemptions from positive mitzvot is not the exclusive nor the only decisive way of gauging whether to perform them. A Jew must be saturated with an ambition and longing for mitzvot, and not, God forbid, view them as a burden he is inescapably stuck with, that he tries to cast off. This was his whole approach to Avodat Hashem. And even when you can find technical heterim for not sitting in the sukkah, or not doing X, or not doing Y, a Jew should be sho'ef, a Jew, to the best of his ability, if there are not other conflicting needs, should be desirous of doing mitzvot. And he has, in his very passionate way, if you turn the page, he says, he talks about it. He says, the question itself, especially when asked by Israeli youth groups that stand for education in service of Hashem and fear of God, and that no small number of B'nai Torah are involved with, is problematic. This was, his subtle, sweet way of giving criticism. For decades, I was in the diaspora in places where the mitzvah of sukkah was not considered an easy mitzvah. Ask anybody who grew up in New York, before we all lived in Teaneck and Queens. You grew up in Manhattan. Sukkah was a very, very difficult mitzvah in Brooklyn and in New York in an apartment building. And it was never asked about using the traveler's exemption when one is far from the sukkah during the day. Did it ever enter the mind of a businessman that strives to scrupulously fulfill mitzvot, and in the course of his business finds himself in New York skyscrapers to eat his lunch in his office because there's no sukkah in his vicinity? Most people, they'll take you yogurt, they'll have a banana, but they're not going to have a 6-course meal with a sandwich because I don't have a sukkah. So this was, again, one of the first yesodot that a person approaches halacha with is a sense of not just the technical halacha, but a sense of the she'ifah, the desire for Torah, for mitzvot, to do it at the best level, the optimum level, and not to see the mitzvot as a kind of obstacle course that you can jump over and see if I can check off the box, am I technically permitted, but rather a passionate desire to engage in Avodat Hashem. Point number one. Point number two. That's the numbering system. The letters are the points, the numbers are the sources. Point number two. Rav Lichtenstein, as many have mentioned, in his learning, as well as in his psak halacha, was scrupulously honest. Meaning that even if he came to a conclusion, what he wanted from both his interlocutors, as well as the person that he was dealing with, he wanted to put things on the table. Whenever he would write about something, he wanted to see it from multiple perspectives and be honest. And one of the things that got under his skin, so to speak, so much was when people presented issues in monochromatic form and paskined as if this was the only possible way of dealing with very complex issues. So two recent examples in the last decade, of course, are the question of the pullout from Gaza that Rabbi Krauss mentioned, the hitnatkut. If you remembered, or if those who don't remember but can read about it, during the hitnatkut, Rav Avram Shapira Zatzal, the great Rosh Yeshiva of Merkaz Arav and the former chief rabbi of the state of Israel, gave a very, very strong psak that no soldier is allowed to participate in the hitnatkut, and you must refuse orders, and any soldier that doesn't, so he used the term lo yinakeh, which is a very strong language. It comes from, right, the Aseres HaDibros, right? Lo v'nakeh lo yinakeh, will never be forgiven, never be absolved of the responsibility that he has. So this got under Rav Lichtenstein's skin. So Rav Lichtenstein, in his very respectful way, wrote a very famous letter to Rabbi Avram Shapiro that was eventually translated into English as well. And I'll just read a few lines. You determine that whoever fails to obey his ruling, he's speaking in the third person to him, your ruling, will not be cleared. This phrase is exceedingly harsh. It was what moved our sages to include the prohibition of taking a false oath amongst the most severe prohibitions. So Rav Aaron asks, what are the principles and sources on the basis of which the evacuation of a settlement in the land of Israel is included amongst the most severe transgressions? And he speaks about the fact that ideologically, Rabbi Shapiro, you know, of course, that there were great Gedolei Yisrael, like the Rav, who took a different position on the abstract question. Before we get to the concrete question, in 2005, is the Hitnatkut good for the Jews or bad for the Jews? The question of abstractly, can you ever think of returning or giving up territory to someone else? He writes, you are of course aware that the Rav, who resolutely and vigorously asserted there is no prohibition to hand over portions of the land of Israel to the nations of the world when there are considerations of saving life. And moreover held that the definition of these considerations must take into account the views of military and political leaders. So he says on an abstract level. On the second level, he says, you reject the Rav's approach, but is it obvious to say a few lines later that anyone who adopts it and acts accordingly will not be cleared? Is there no room to clear him, even according to the assumptions of your ruling in line with the Rambam? If a person heard that a child drowned at sea and he spared out a net to rescue him but he only caught fish, he is exempt from all liability. That is to say that in a case where a person's actions are motivated by a desire to save life, he can be excused from liability because of his motivation. And then he continues and he says, on a technical level, you, Rav Shapira, argue that it's an Isra of lo techanem, which is a prohibition in the Torah of giving non-Jews chanaya bakarka, a foothold in the land. And he says, however, it is a matter of public knowledge that you permit the sale of the land in the land of Israel in order to cope with the problems of the Shemitah year. So, lo techanem, you yourself admit, is not an absolute Isur, but it's contextualized. What's the answer why it's not lo techanem for the heter mechira? Because it's in the interest of the Yishuv. You sell the land because it's not considered an Isur if you're doing it for the purpose of strengthening the Yishuv. So if those political leaders who think that the Hitnatkut will help in the long run, in 2005, will help in the long run of history, how can you say it's lo yinakeh? How can you say it's lo techane? Etc., etc. And so basically Rav Aaron was saying to Rav Shapira, you know, we can't speak in halachic terms. When we deal with halacha, these issues are very complex. These issues, you're entitled to your opinion, you're entitled to forcefully. But to make these categorical statements that halacha, Judaism says X or Y, is simply not educationally right and not halachically right. The same thing came up 5 years later in Tzfat, when Rav Shmuel Eliyahu issued a psak because there were a lot of Arabs from the Galilee moving into Tzfat, and there was a lot of tension, and there was a lot of issues, and Rav Shmuel Eliyahu issued a psak that it was forbidden to rent apartments to non-Jews in Tzfat. And again, Rav Lichtenstein writes in a very respectful way. He writes a long essay, a long letter to Rav Shmuel Eliyahu that eventually was published. And here too, he says, if you look at the fourth paragraph, but therein lies the problem on the next page. The prohibition of selling homes to Gentiles is presented as the exclusive halachic position in the matter at hand, and the voice that bursts forth from the throats of the signatories is made to sound like the single unequivocal word of God, that is halacha. Here one asks, is this indeed so? Without a doubt, the position expressed in the letter is based on rabbinic sources and a long halachic tradition. Yet taken as a whole, the document leaves one with the impression that its conclusions are based on presumptions that categorize a particular but not exclusive halachic approach. And so Rav Aaron goes through Siriatum, he goes through a number of points. He says, the first paragraph of the letter gives the impression that Rambam linked intermarriage, selling a parcel of land, and the desecration of God's name. It further implies that there is no escaping the conjunction of these elements. However, there is no such formulation in the writings of the Rambam. The concluding paragraph states that one who sells a residence to a Gentile must be excommunicated. This ruling is patently erroneous. The excommunication discussed by the Talmud and Rishonim addresses harm to Jewish neighbors in the context of the issue of Dina de Bar Metzra, unrelated to the questions of Lo Techanem or Lo Yeshvu Ba'artzecha. And etc., etc. He talks about the different issues of Lo Techanem. He talks about the issues. Again, the point is that there are many, many perspectives here that are not being addressed when we approach issues of halacha. And so this is a second major thrust in any of Rav Aaron's approach to psak halacha, including in many of the private tshuvot that he gave. It was always a sense of, here are the various positions, here are the various issues, here you can give weight to this, you can give weight to that. It was not ex cathedra, but it was making sure that the totality of the topic is understood and appreciated, which gets us to our second point, our third point, because for Rav Lichtenstein, this was a major issue, which gets us to our third major issue, and that is halacha and the interplay with moral and human factors, which means, given the fact that halacha is so multifaceted and multi-layered and tiered and nuanced, for Rav Aaron, it was very important, and this is a very important point, number 4. He writes in this essay, Hora is comprised of two elements, psak and psika. The former refers to codification, the formulation of the law pertinent to a given area, and it is most characteristically manifested of one position in preference to others. As such, it is essentially the concluding phase of the learning process. Psika, by contrast, denotes implementation. It bespeaks the application of what has been forged into a particular situation. And here, this was very critical for Rav Lichtenstein, that we cannot blur the two areas. Psak may be the final codification. Psak fundamentally is about codification. Psika is dealing with all the factors that went into the codification in the context of all the other values, pressures, factors, what he called often differential psak, to understand the context and what you're dealing with, and know that there is a tremendous amount of material that has to be addressed. And so, therefore, and that's where the human and the social factors, which are built into the halachic system, becomes critical. And this was something that for Rav Lichtenstein was very, very important when he dealt with a shaila. He approaches it by presenting I wouldn't say a straw man, but because it's not a straw man, because there are people who believe this, but he contrasts an approach which sees halacha in very formulistic terms and sees the ideal posek as one who has no agenda, who has no intuitions, who has no nitiot, who has no, is kind of an objective, tabula rasa in approaching a question. So he writes, some people would have us believe that the ideal posek is a faceless and heartless supercomputer into whom all the relevant data is fed and who then produces the right answer, or who follows a code down the line without any swerving to the left or right. Should the standard not be met, the shortfall is to be regarded as a failing, the lamentable result of human frailty, in Bacon's terms, a manifestation of besetting idols which hamper and hinder the capacity for reasoned judgment. On this reading, the process of psika, properly conceived and executed, bears no semblance to an existential encounter between seeker and respondent. It entails rather the application of text to problem, the coupling of code to situation. If you look at the next paragraph, purist proponents of this approach often cry it up as the frum view of psika.
In reality, however, this approach, this portrait of a posek is a mere caricature, lined by those who at most karu v'shanu, but certainly lo shimshu tamidei chachamim. As anyone who has been privileged to observe Gedolim at close hand can readily attest, they approach Psak doubly animated by responsibility to halacha and sensitivity to human concerns. And in the rest of this piece, Rav Lichtenstein quotes two tshuvot that became famous because of Rav Lichtenstein, constantly citing them in various settings. One is a tshuva of Reb Chaim Volozhiner. Reb Chaim Volozhiner, in his great sefer Chut HaMeshulash, paskin l'kula about a certain aguna shaila. And a chaver of his from his time in Volozhin attacked him. And so Reb Chaim Volozhin wrote back, second paragraph, I see that in most matters we're of like mind, except for the fact that his honor leans towards stringency, since the matter does not depend upon him. Likewise, before the yoke of practical decision was thrust upon me, I too did not incline toward the leniencies arising from legal analysis. In our great sins, however, the generation has been orphaned of sages, and now the yoke of practical halachic decision-making has been thrust upon me. So he says to him, look, you're sitting in the Beis Medrash in the ivory tower, so you have the luxury of paskening l'chumra and being yotze zayin all the shitas. But I have a woman in front of me, I have an aguna shaila, and the thrust of halacha is mishum aguna hikiluba Rabbanan. The thrust of halacha says to me that I have to deal with this human situation, and therefore I am going to pull out all the stops that are in the system itself to try to resolve this real painful situation of this shaila. And of course, two other famous tshuvot of the Masas Binyamin, who became blind in his old age, and is addressing the question on a personal level of whether he himself could get an aliyah. And again, here, this is the greatest example of those who ever tell you that poskim never start with any sense of where the halacha should go. Doesn't mean they always get there, but poskim, the idea that poskim are never, okay, sometimes it's more explicit, sometimes it's less explicit. But here's an example. If you look at the last paragraph, from now in my old age, my eyes have become dim, and according to the Beis Yosef's opinion, I should be banished from sharing the Lord's inheritance. And I should not be counted amongst those suitable for an aliyah. Therefore I said and determined to myself, heaven forfend that I depart from the path, etc., etc. Thus I commenced halachic research to determine why the Beis Yosef has done this to me, etc. So the human dimension, as part and parcel of the factors of the texts that a person have to apply, is central. And therefore, Rav Lichtenstein, if you look next page, and would we have it otherwise? This is so beautiful line. Does anyone truly yearn for a dayan who approaches an aguna and a blitztrup, right? Some blood in the some blood in the egg, with the same degree of equanimity? Chazal certainly did not. The operative rule, Kedaihu Rebbe Lezer lismoch alav b'shas hadchak, is clearly predicated upon the assumption that a posek can recognize an hour of need and may strive to respond to it. Implicit in this formulation is the concept of differential psak, the principle that divergent answers may be given to the identical halachic question depending on attendant human and social circumstances. And that's the key. The key is to recognize this was a major factor. I know, again, I said I have a number of private tshuvot from Rav Aaron. Kedaihu Rabbi X lismoch alav b'shas hadchak is a central pillar of adjudicating serious, sensitive halachic questions. And of course, this is rooted, of course, and again, we don't have the time, this is rooted in a broader conception of halachic pluralism, of elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chayim, as understood by the Chachmei Tzarfat, quoted by the Ritva, that in Erevin Daf Yud Gimel, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu revealed to Moshe Rabbeinu 70 approaches to this way and 70 approaches this way, and in each generation, each Bezdin is given the power to interpret the halacha as they understand it, and that becomes the normative halacha. Okay? Rav Soloveitchik, Zichron Zatzal, once he gave, you know the famous Mishnah in Adius Perak Aleph, Mishnah Hey, that says, V'lama maskirim divrei hayechidim im divrei harabim. Why did the Mishnah choose to include the positions of those that are rejected? Why not just be a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch? So the Mishnah in Adius says, K'dei sheyismechu aleihem. And there's the Rosh Mishans there, has a very beautiful long discussion. Again, similarly, the idea that opinions that are not necessarily normative in the normal situations are still in play for other situations. Now, how far do you go with that? Is there a cutoff date? You know, the Gemara, the Mishnah, the Shulchan Aruch. Those are interesting debates. I wrote about this in a number of years ago in the volume for Rabbi Berman. But this is a fascinating issue, but it is at the heart of the great poskim. Kedaihu Rabbi X lismach alav b'shasatcha. So I was mentioning the Rav once, he said in Shir, he said, do you think somebody who learns all day, 8 hours a day, he just spends time on the Shita of Beis Shammai in the Sugya, which is rejected, you think you don't say Birchas HaTorah on that? Because you're learning something which is not lahalacha? Of course not. It still has the Cheftza Shel Torah, and it's still a valid idea of Torah, obviously. And this is, of course, the idea, and that all of these issues, as if you look in the next point, for the committed Jew, halacha as a normative order can never be superseded by external pleasures. A specific halacha may be flexibly applied and in a sense superseded by the internal dynamics of the halachic system. And this in two distinct ways. The first entails recourse to a phalanx of factors, which include pikuach nefesh, but other factors, local and general, also abound. These include physical and psychological pain, tsar haguf, tsar hanefesh, financial hardship, hefsed meruba, social harmony, shalom bayis, human dignity, kvod habriot, sensitivity to any of which can affect psak measurably. So here is a very nice summary of these are the factors that every posek, if they're serious about psak, has to take into account when they're dealing with these very difficult issues. I mean, the easy issues, okay, those are easy. That's not hard. You know, is there 60? You know, is there shishim or is there not shishim? But what is this person's situation? That's a much more complicated issue. Now, of course, Rav Aaron, it was a balanced, very balanced, and recognizing this, he at the same time is very cautious, and rightly so, because on the one hand you want to maintain continuity, and he was not a revolutionary in most areas. And he writes in that same essay, these are imminent questions to be honestly and consciously confronted, meaning how far do you go? And we have no right to demand of a posek, almost as a matter of moral and personal right, the most comforting answer. And here he takes a jab at Blue. The notion that when there is a rabbinic will, there is a halachic way, both in Salz Gedolei Torah and it's in, I can't even pronounce this word, view of the totality of halacha, verges on the blasphemous. What we do expect of a posek is that he walk the extra mile, whatever for him it may be, harnessing knowledge and imagination in an attempt to abide by his responsibility to both the Torah, with which he has been entrusted, whose pangs he has internalized, and to his anguished fellows, etc. For insensitive psikah is not only lamentable apathy or poor public policy, it is bad halacha. To the extent that kvod habriot, for instance, permits a violation, be it of a derabanan, actively, or doraisa, passively, shev al taisa, failure to act on that principle undercuts a spiritual idea. The Rav was fond of quoting the Chafetz Chaim to the effect that interruption of Kriyat Shema, mipnei hakavod, was not only permissible but mandatory. So, now, I would formulate this, and I think I once told Blue that I thought she would have been more successful if she said, just flip it a little bit. Instead of saying where there's a halachic will, where there's a rabbinic will, there's a halachic way, you should say where there's a rabbinic way, is there a halachic will? Which is a different formulation, because what it means is when there's a legitimate halachic approach, do you have the courage and the sense to act upon it. That's a little bit of a different spin. I think would have gotten less critique. Okay, so this is certainly, and of course, Rav Aaron spoke about this, and he also, in a number of his essays, there's a famous essay he wrote and he never published it till about a few years ago, about Judaism and humanism. So already in the 1960s, in the late 1960s, he has a few passages in there where he is critical of poskim at the time for not using publicly and clearly these inherent elements in the system more broadly. And he understands, he says, poskim, especially in the modern era, are often reluctant to involve broad axiological heterim. This is from the article in 1998. In the 60s, he was a little more sharp, and he understands it, because psika can congeal into psak, and decision issue with trepidation in light of special circumstances may then enter the halachic world as a precedent, etc., etc. We should realize, however, that such reserve may exact a practical and educational toll, as awareness of certain values and their place within halacha may become jaded. So he says, but you pay a price when poskim find ways to matir something without explicitly telling you their real, so to speak, agenda, that it's driven by kvod habrios or kvod this, and they're not telling you specifically because they're concerned how it'll be interpreted. You exact a price in terms of educationally. And be that as it may, we can recognize the position of the human and social factor. And Rav Aaron was very consistent in his famous piece on abortion. He writes the same thing. Rav Aaron was in the abstract, he was very machmir. In his piece on abortion, when he starts the piece, he gets very close to the position that abortion abstractly is close to murder, based on, you know, if it's murder for Bnei Noach, is there something which is not, which is, mutter? You don't want to have a lower moral ceiling for Jews than for non-Jews. But at the end, he talks about the factors that can set it aside. So he says, firstly, the reader has surely discerned the number of places I've refrained from setting down definitive conclusions, but I've been satisfied to indicate general principles. And he says that's not just because I'm naturally hesitant, it's because that's the nature of halacha. These are areas which on the one hand the halachic details are not clearly fleshed out, and on the other hand the personal circumstances are often complex and perplexing. In such areas there is room and, in my opinion, obligation for a measure of flexibility. A sensitive posek recognizes both the gravity of the personal situation and the seriousness of the halachic factors. In one case, therefore, he may tend to view the points of contention in one way, while in a second case exhibiting slightly different details. He may tilt the decision on these points in the other direction. And he gives examples. He may reach a different kind of equilibrium in assessing the views of his predecessor, sometimes allowing far-reaching positions to carry great weight, while in other cases ignoring them. He might stretch the halachic limits of leniency where serious domestic tragedy looms, shalom bayis, or hold firm to the strict interpretation of the law when, as he reads the situation, the pressure for leniency stems from frivolous attitudes and reflects a debased moral compass. So again, the issue of halachic psak differentiation is central. The last issue is a point which is very tantalizing, which Rav Aaron did not flesh out. Yes? Yeah, I'm going to... The last point, which if you turn to D, which Rav Aaron did not always flesh out, but it has a lot of tantalizingly interesting possibilities, is the role... Until now we've been talking about the human and social factor in liming halacha as internal factors within the system. Kvod habriot, shlom bayit, hefsid meruba, kedai hu Rebbe Lezer lismach lo b'shas hadchak. What's shas hadchak? Psychological, physical, economic. That's internal. But what about the realm of the moral and the ethical that's external to the halacha? Not just as a philosophical question like in that famous essay Rav Lichtenstein wrote, but also in terms of actually maybe shaping some of our halachic understandings. So here, again, very, very famous but tantalizingly interesting points. in his very famous essay, Being Frum and Being Good, when there's a conflict between the tzav and the moral order, what do we do about it? For us, the answer is particularly difficult, practically difficult, but surely is conceptually clear and unequivocal. That's, after all, the story of the Akedah. So on the one hand, you have the Akedah, which the Rav, of course, the model of total surrender. We surrender even our moral intuitions. On the other hand, second paragraph, this is not to say that there is, in such a context, there is no room for moral sensibility. Surely in relating to halacha, including those areas which one may find morally difficult, there is some role for conscience, some role for the goodness in us, particularly in an interpretive capacity. Rav Aaron uses the model of the Midrash, where Avram is struggling. Is this really what God is telling me? As a model for how one approaches difficult moral halachic issues, because that means that one is allowed to struggle with them. You understand? That's the model that he uses. And that's what he said in this essay in Hebrew, which I translated part of it at the bottom. The parameters of ethics and morality and its truths have an important role to play in understanding halacha and defining its boundaries. Of course, a Jew must be ready to answer the call, hineni, if the command, halelu lo'olah, is thrust upon him. However, prior to unsheathing the sword, he is permitted and even obligated to clarify to the best of his ability. Is this what actually has been commanded? Is the command so clear-cut? As the collision of values so frontal and unavoidable? To the extent that there is a need and room for halachic exegesis, and this must be clarified, a sensitive and insightful conscience is one of the factors that shape the decision-making process. Just as Rambam in his day consciously was assisted by a particular metaphysical approach to the world in order to plumb the depths, this is a fascinating analogy, that your moral compass can affect your understanding of sources or how you paskin, just like the Rambam used Aristotelian metaphysics to understand the Torah and understand what it means. Yad chazakan zron etuyah. Fascinating. Again, Rav Aaron, it is very tantalizing. What do you do with it is an interesting question. For Rav Aaron, of course, it was the Einei Ha'eda, it was the great leaders, the poskim, who were entrusted to handle those issues carefully. And I finish with this beautiful story that indicates that gisha, that Rav Aaron, this beautiful story about Rav Shlomo Zalman. You know that after Rav Aaron made Aliyah, and after the Rav got sick, Rav Shlomo Zalman really became the person, his go-to person, that he turned to on issues when he felt he couldn't himself handle in halacha. And he tells a story at the end. Once I visited Rav Shlomo Zalman, I asked him about the issue of wearing a hearing aid on Shabbat. He permitted it. At the same time, he told me, you know, I can't believe it. Someone sent me a letter from the States saying that Rav Aaron Kotler Zatzal was careful not to talk to a person wearing a hearing aid on Shabbat for fear of speaking to him in the hearing aid and therefore performing a malacha. He told me that he couldn't believe it. He said, imagine, as if it's not enough that this person has been punished by heaven that he's deaf. The Gemara states that if someone is wounded in such a way to become deaf, he is paid nezek shalem, as though he has ceased to function. This punishment isn't sufficient. Imagine you meet him in the street, and instead of greeting him, you say, You don't talk to the person. He said, how can... So that's Rav Shlomo Zalman. He couldn't bring himself to believe that this was a situation required. This is an intuition of a posek who simply can't imagine that that's what the halal... Now, of course... Where do you apply that? How do you apply it? What kind of mechanisms in the system you use are, of course, challenging. So we examined a little bit of some key issues, some key hadgeshim, some key emphases within the worldview of Lichtenstein in approaching Psak Halacha. May his memory be a blessing, and we should continue to derive a tremendous strength, guidance, and challenge from what he taught us. He's Zichro Baruch. Yes, Rabbi.